"Joseph, my son," she said, her voice soft, almost fragile. His heart stopped. The word "son" echoed in his mind, a punch to the gut that left him breathless. This woman, his mother. After all these years. He took a step back, shock and disbelief swelling in his chest. Could this really be her? The woman who had left him as a child, who had disappeared from his life without a trace. "What do you want?" Joseph asked, his voice cold, distant, and hard, the words cutting through the air like shards of ice. Just as Joseph was about to send Mama Divine away, Glory entered the room. She looked at the woman kneeling at the door and then at Joseph, her face filled with confusion. The sight of Mama Divine, tired, fragile, and almost broken, struck her, and she immediately knew something was wrong. "Who is this?" Glory asked softly, her voice carrying the weight of concern. Joseph's heart skipped a beat. Panic rose within him. He didn't want Glory to see this part of his life, this painful and messy history he had been trying to bury for so long. Without thinking, without fully grasping the consequences, he quickly said, She's my maid." In the bustling city of Abuja, there was a small boy named Joseph. Joseph was only 10 years old, but he already knew a lot about survival. Life hadn't been kind to him, and he had no family to lean on. No father to guide him, no mother to comfort him, and no siblings to share his pain or joy. He was utterly alone, yet every day, he faced life with remarkable courage and determination. Joseph's world was a rough corner of the city, where the hustle and bustle never seemed to end. His home was nothing more than a tiny corner in a rundown alley, tucked away from the crowded streets. This makeshift shelter was all he had. A flattened cardboard box served as his bed, and a tattered cloth he found on a rainy night was his blanket. In one corner, he kept a small plastic bag containing his few precious belongings, an old photograph of his parents, a notebook with blank pages, and a pencil stub that he treasured as though it were made of gold. Despite his challenging circumstances, Joseph had an unshakable spirit. Every morning, as the sun rose over the tall buildings and cast its golden light on the city, Joseph would wake up with a sense of purpose. Life was tough, but he believed in a better tomorrow. Joseph's main source of income was selling meat pies and fish rolls. Balancing a tray on his head, he would walk through the busy streets, weaving between cars and pedestrians, calling out in his clear, energetic voice, "Hot meat pies. Fresh fish rolls. Come and buy." His voice carried over the noise of the city, and his genuine smile often drew people in. Even though he worked hard, Joseph's earnings were meager. After paying the woman, who allowed him to take the meat pies and fish rolls on credit, he was left with just enough to buy himself a simple meal of bread and water. Sometimes, on better days, he saved a little money, holding on to the dream that kept him going, the dream of going to school. Joseph was fascinated by schools. Whenever he passed by one, he would stop and watch the children in their neatly pressed uniforms, carrying colorful backpacks filled with books. They laughed and chatted as they entered the school gates, and their joy was like a spark of hope in Joseph's heart. He dreamed of wearing a uniform, sitting in a classroom, and raising his hand to answer a question. But for now, school was a far-off dream, one he couldn't afford yet. When Joseph wasn't selling meat pies and fish rolls, he had another way of earning money, picking up plastic bottles. The streets of Abuja were filled with discarded bottles, especially around markets and bus stops. To most people, they were just trash, but to Joseph, they were opportunities. Armed with a small sack, he would walk through alleys and crowded areas, scanning every corner for bottles. When he found one, he'd carefully pick it up, adding it to his collection. At the end of the day, he'd sell them to recyclers for a small amount. Every coin he earned brought him a tiny step closer to fulfilling his dream. Joseph's days were exhausting, but he found joy in the little things, kind smiles from strangers, a friendly word from a customer, or a cool breeze after a hot afternoon. Sometimes, he even imagined what it would be like to have a family again, to sit around a table and share a meal with people who loved him. But until that day came, Joseph relied on his resilience and his unwavering belief that life could get better. As he walked through the streets, balancing his tray and calling out to customers. Joseph wasn't just a boy selling snacks. He was a dreamer, a fighter, and a reminder that even in the hardest circumstances, hope could shine brighter than the sun over Abuja's crowded streets. Every morning was a new beginning, and every step he took brought him closer to his dream. He didn't know how or when his life would change, but deep in his heart, he believed that someday, it would. One sunny afternoon in the lively streets of Abuja, Joseph was busy picking bottles near a bustling market. The clatter of vendors, the honking of cars, and the chatter of passers-by filled the air, but Joseph was focused. His eyes darted from corner to corner, searching for discarded plastic bottles. As he bent down to pick one near the edge of a building, a faint voice caught his attention. Curious, he followed the sound until he found himself outside a small classroom with an open window. The voice was clear now, it was a teacher speaking. Joseph froze, mesmerized by the unfamiliar words flowing from the teacher's lips. The man inside was explaining something about numbers and science, using a chalkboard filled with equations and diagrams. Joseph didn't understand most of it, but he was captivated. He pressed closer, standing on his toes to get a better view through the window. Inside, children sat at desks, their heads bent over notebooks, their hands raised eagerly to answer questions. Joseph's heart swelled with a longing so strong it made his chest ache. That night, as Joseph lay on his cardboard bed in his alleyway corner, the image of the classroom played over and over in his mind. He closed his eyes and imagined himself wearing a school uniform, sitting at a desk with a pencil in hand, solving problems on a chalkboard. He could almost hear the teacher calling his name to answer a question. The thought filled him with a determination he had never felt before. Clutching his old cloth blanket tighter, Joseph made a silent promise to himself. One day, no matter how hard it was, he would go to school. He would sit in a classroom, learn math and science, and maybe even make friends. The next morning, Joseph woke up with a new sense of purpose. He worked harder than ever, balancing his tray of meat pies and fish rolls on his head as he navigated the crowded streets. His voice rang out louder, his steps were quicker, and his smile was brighter as he sold to customers. When the day's work was done, he picked bottles late into the evening, searching every corner he could find. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Joseph saved every naira he could. Sometimes, he skipped meals, drinking water instead of eating, just to add a few more coins to his stash. He kept his money in a small tin can he hid carefully in his shelter. Each time he added to it, his dream felt a little closer. Finally, one morning, Joseph counted his savings and realized he had enough to buy a second-hand school uniform and a few books. His hands trembled with excitement as he held the money, imagining himself finally stepping into a classroom. That afternoon, Joseph walked to a nearby school he had often passed while selling snacks. It was a small, modest building, but to Joseph, it was a place of endless possibilities. Clutching his tin can of savings, he walked through the school gates, his heart pounding. Inside, Joseph approached a group of teachers standing near the entrance. They turned to him, surprised by the sight of the small boy with torn clothes, dusty feet, and rough hands. But Joseph's eyes shone with determination as he explained why he was there. He showed them his savings, carefully pouring out the coins he had worked so hard to earn. The teachers exchanged glances, their expressions softening as they listened to Joseph's story. They saw the hope in his eyes and the sincerity in his voice. One teacher knelt down to his level and asked, "Are you sure you want this? School can be tough, and it's not just about money. It's about hard work, discipline, and commitment." Joseph nodded firmly. "I'll do anything," he said. "I just want to learn." The teachers were moved by his determination. After a brief discussion, they agreed to enroll him. They took his savings and helped him buy a uniform and a few basic supplies. Joseph could hardly believe it as they handed him the neatly folded uniform. That night, as he lay in his makeshift shelter, Joseph held the uniform close to his chest, a smile spreading across his face. For the first time in a long while, he felt like his dream was no longer just a dream, it was becoming a reality. The teachers at the school couldn't help but be moved by Joseph's story. Despite not having a guardian or anyone to officially sign him up, they decided to make an exception. They arranged for him to attend classes, knowing how much it meant to him. Joseph could hardly believe it when they handed him his schedule and welcomed him to the school. On his first day, Joseph stepped into the classroom, his second-hand uniform neatly ironed. His heart raced as he took a seat at the back of the class. Around him, children whispered and giggled, some casting curious glances at the new boy. But Joseph wasn't bothered. He was finally in a classroom, and that was all that mattered. As the teacher began the lesson, Joseph leaned forward, hanging on to every word. His eyes sparkled with excitement as he scribbled notes into his notebook. For the first time in his life, he felt like he belonged somewhere. Over the weeks that followed, Joseph's passion for learning became evident to everyone. He was always the first to raise his hand when the teacher asked a question, and he soaked up every lesson like a sponge. Subjects like mathematics and science fascinated him, and he spent hours after school trying to solve problems and understand new concepts. Despite his challenges, Joseph quickly became one of the brightest students in the school. The teachers were amazed by his curiosity and determination. They often found him staying back after class to ask questions or borrow books from the small school library. He had no one to help him with homework or buy him new clothes, but he didn't let that stop him. Every morning, he arrived at school with a smile, eager to learn. But while school brought Joseph joy, his struggles outside the classroom didn't disappear. After classes, he returned to the streets, balancing his tray of meat pies and fish rolls as he called out to customers. In the evenings, he scavenged for bottles, carefully adding every coin he earned to his savings tin. His life was a constant balance of school and work, with little time for play. Yet, Joseph didn't complain. He knew he was working towards something greater. Each day, he reminded himself that every step he took brought him closer to the future he dreamed of. One day, as Joseph walked home from school, carrying his one notebook under his arm, he noticed other children walking with their parents. They laughed and talked, their parents carrying their bags and asking about their day. Joseph slowed his steps, watching the joyful scenes unfold around him. A little boy ran to his mother, who scooped him up in a warm hug. Another child tugged at his father's hand, chattering excitedly about a game they had played in school. A sharp pang of loneliness gripped Joseph's chest. He stopped for a moment, clutching his notebook tightly as he tried to push the feeling away. But no matter how hard he tried, the ache lingered. He imagined what it would be like to have someone waiting for him at the end of the day, asking about his lessons, praising his efforts, or simply holding his hand as they walked home together. Joseph swallowed hard and forced himself to keep walking. His steps were slower now, his mind filled with thoughts of the family he had never known. As he approached his alleyway corner, the familiar sight of his makeshift shelter reminded him of how far he had come and how far he still had to go. That evening, as Joseph lay on his cardboard bed, he stared up at the stars visible through the gaps in the buildings. The loneliness was still there, but so was his determination. He reminded himself of the promise he had made, to build a better future for himself, no matter how hard it got. Maybe one day, he whispered to the night sky, I have someone who cares about me. But until then, I keep going. With that thought, he closed his eyes, ready to face whatever challenges the next day would bring. Years later, he entered into university. Joseph's life was nothing like it used to be. His recycling business, which had started with him picking bottles off the streets, had grown far beyond what he ever imagined. Now, he had a team of boys from the same streets he once roamed. They worked with him, collecting and sorting bottles, earning honest pay that helped them avoid the hardships and dangers Joseph had faced as a child. Each of the boys admired Joseph deeply. To them, he was more than just a boss, he was proof that it was possible to rise above the streets and create a better life. Joseph never forgot where he came from, and he treated his workers with kindness and respect. He mentored them, encouraging them to think about their futures and set goals, just as he had done. One sunny afternoon, as Joseph stood at his recycling center, overseeing the sorting of materials, a man in a crisp suit walked in. His presence immediately drew attention, and Joseph stepped forward to greet him. The man smiled warmly and extended his hand. Good afternoon. My name is Mr. Felix, and I'm a representative from the Abuja state government, the man said, his voice steady and professional. Joseph shook his hand, curious but slightly nervous. Good afternoon, sir. How can I help you? Mr. Felix's smile widened. Actually, it's the government that wants to help you. We've been monitoring your efforts to clean up the city and reduce waste. Your work has not only made a positive environmental impact but has also provided opportunities for many young people. It's inspiring, Joseph. Joseph's heart raced as he listened. The man's words felt surreal, like something out of a dream. We believe you have the potential to make an even greater difference, Mr. Felix continued. The government wants to support you in expanding your operations further. With additional resources and funding, you could scale your business to reach more areas and create even more impact. For a moment, Joseph was speechless. Just a few years ago, he had been a boy scavenging for bottles to survive, and now, the government wanted to partner with him. He felt a wave of pride and gratitude, not only for the opportunity but for the journey that had brought him here. I don't know what to say, Joseph finally managed, his voice filled with emotion. Thank you, sir. I'm truly honored. Mr. Felix nodded. You've earned it, Joseph. Keep up the good work. With the government's support, Joseph's recycling business grew beyond anything he could have dreamed. He expanded his operations to multiple locations across Abuja, employing more people and collaborating with local companies to recycle on a larger scale. His name became known not just in his community but across the city as a young entrepreneur with a vision and a heart for change. As his recycling empire blossomed, Joseph found himself earning more money than he had ever imagined. He thought back to the days when he had barely enough to buy food, when every coin was precious, and every meal was a blessing. Now, he had enough to afford a comfortable life. With his first big earnings, Joseph rented a modest but cozy apartment. It was a far cry from the cardboard bed he once slept on in the alley. The apartment had clean walls, a soft bed, and even a small table where he could study. For the first time, Joseph felt a sense of true stability. He also bought himself some new clothes, carefully choosing items that were simple yet presentable. He wanted to look professional and confident without forgetting his humble beginnings. Despite his newfound wealth, Joseph remained grounded. He continued to live modestly, investing most of his earnings back into his business and the community. As he stood on the balcony of his apartment one evening, looking out at the bustling streets of Abuja, Joseph felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He had come so far from the little boy who wandered the streets, selling meat pies and picking bottles. But even as he achieved success, Joseph knew his journey was far from over. There was still so much he wanted to do, not just for himself, but for others like him who were still struggling to find their way. This is only the beginning, Joseph said to himself, determination shining in his eyes. With a heart full of gratitude and a mindset on making an even greater impact, Joseph prepared for the next chapter of his incredible journey. Despite all his success, Joseph felt a void deep within him. The day of his university graduation arrived, and while his classmates were surrounded by family members cheering and celebrating, Joseph stood alone. The joy and pride of the occasion were overshadowed by an overwhelming sense of loneliness. He watched as his peers hugged their parents, posed for photos, and celebrated with loved ones. His heart ached with longing as he clutched his certificate, the weight of his solitary journey pressing on him. As the ceremony wound down and Joseph prepared to leave quietly, a voice broke through his thoughts. You don't have anyone here, do you? Joseph turned to see a young woman standing beside him. It was Glory, a classmate he had noticed in passing but never really spoken to. She was known for her kind nature and a warm, radiant smile that seemed to light up any room she entered. For a moment, Joseph couldn't find the words to respond. He simply nodded, feeling a lump form in his throat. Glory's smile didn't falter. She reached into her bag, pulled out her phone, and held it out. Here, she said with gentle enthusiasm. Let's take a picture together. We can celebrate together. Joseph blinked in surprise but managed a small smile as they posed for a few pictures. For the first time that day, he felt the weight of his loneliness lift, even if just a little. After the photos, they started talking. Glory asked about his life, his journey, and his plans for the future. At first, Joseph hesitated, unsure if he should share the details of his struggles and triumphs. But something about Glory's genuine interest and warm demeanor encouraged him to open up. He told her about his humble beginnings, his days of selling meat pies and fish rolls, and picking bottles to survive. He shared how he had grown his recycling business from the ground up and how it had become a beacon of hope for others like him. Glory listened intently, her admiration for him growing with every word. "You're incredible, Joseph," she said softly, her eyes shining with respect. "You've been through so much, yet you've accomplished so much more. You should be proud of yourself." Joseph felt a warmth he hadn't experienced in a long time. For the first time, someone saw him not just as a success story but as a person who had overcome incredible odds. Before they parted ways, they exchanged phone numbers and promised to stay in touch. Over the following months, Glory became a constant presence in Joseph's life. They spent time together, sharing meals, visiting parks, and discussing their dreams. Glory's kindness and intelligence left a lasting impression on Joseph, and he found himself looking forward to their conversations more than anything else. One evening, as they sat together discussing his business, Glory proposed a bold idea. "What if you partnered with local businesses?" she suggested. "You could create a system where they support your recycling efforts, and in return, they get recognized for being environmentally responsible. It's a win-win, and it would bring even more attention to your work." Joseph listened intently, impressed by her insight. "That's brilliant," he said after a moment of thought. "I've never considered that before, but it makes so much sense." Inspired by her suggestion, Joseph wasted no time putting the idea into action. He reached out to local businesses, pitching the idea of partnerships that promoted recycling while benefiting their brands. The response was overwhelmingly positive, and within months, his business expanded even further. The partnerships not only boosted his operations but also attracted media attention. Soon, news outlets across Abuja began featuring Joseph's story. Articles and television segments highlighted his journey from the streets to becoming an environmental entrepreneur, inspiring countless others. Businesses, schools, and even government agencies began reaching out to collaborate with him, and his impact on the community grew exponentially. Through it all, Glory remained by his side, celebrating his victories and encouraging him during challenges. Joseph often found himself marveling at how much his life had changed since the day they first met. Glory wasn't just a friend, she had become his confidant, his partner in ideas, and a source of unwavering support. And for the first time in a long while, Joseph didn't feel alone anymore. He had found not only success but also a connection that made his achievements all the more meaningful. Grateful and overwhelmed by her unwavering support, Joseph began to realize the depth of his feelings for Glory. She wasn't just a friend or a partner in ideas, she had become his source of strength, someone who made him feel whole in ways he'd never imagined. Her kindness, intelligence, and boundless compassion reflected everything he had ever dreamed of in a partner. Glory had given him something he had longed for all his life, a sense of belonging. As his love for her grew stronger, Joseph started envisioning a future with her. He thought about the life they could build together, a life filled with love, mutual respect, and shared dreams. The boy who once wandered the streets of Abuja, searching for scraps to survive, now dreamed of a life with someone who truly believed in him and cared for him. Glory had become the light in Joseph's life, a steady and comforting presence. With her, he felt safe to share his innermost fears and aspirations, things he had always kept buried deep inside. Their friendship grew deeper with each passing day, and soon, Joseph found himself longing to be more than just a friend to her. He wanted her to be his partner, his companion, his everything. One evening, after hosting a particularly successful event for his recycling program, Joseph invited Glory out to celebrate. They chose a quiet, cozy restaurant, where the atmosphere was filled with laughter and the scent of freshly prepared meals. Over plates of jollof rice and grilled fish, they talked about everything, his journey from the streets, her dreams of helping underserved communities, and their shared passion for making the world a better place. "You know," Joseph said, smiling at her, "meeting you feels like finding the missing piece of my life. I don't think I've ever said this, but I'm so grateful for you, Glory. Her cheeks flushed slightly, but she returned his smile. Joseph, you've been through so much and accomplished so much more. I'm just glad I get to be a part of your story. Her words stayed with him, filling his heart with warmth. Over the following weeks, Joseph and Glory spent even more time together. Whether they were brainstorming ideas for his business, volunteering at community events, or simply sharing a quiet moment, Joseph found himself more drawn to her with each passing day.